Hello, and welcome to Starting Points, where one thing leads to another. I've been talking about gulls, and that reminded me of two books, and I'd like to share a bit of the writing of each of those writers. This first book is for adults, and the second one could be read by teens and up. Franklin Russell, the man that came from New Zealand to Canada, the naturalist, and he is writing about Arjun the gull. The gulls pressed on. As they approached the cliffs, Arjun could see murres standing in dense masses on ledges and even more thickly on top of the cliffs. And then, as far as he could see, hill upon hill of them. Their clamor of their voices hit him solidly. It was like a barrier between him and the island. He faltered. But the gulls flew on, and the hurtling murres wheeled underneath Arjun's twisting neck as he strove to see everything at once. He was so absorbed that he missed seeing the other gulls dropping down suddenly and settling on a hillock occupied by a small colony of nesting herring gulls. Then he saw he was alone and turned sharply. He was struck immediately by two speeding murres. He tumbled, feeling pain in his wing, was struck again and knocked sharply downwards. Now he reeled with a conglomerate vision of murres bearing down on him, uncaring or unable to swerve away from him. When he succeeded in landing, the vision of the murres did not diminish. Instead, it intensified as he looked one way and another and saw the sky moving with their lithe, little black and white forms. He remained motionless, ignoring the other herring gulls stirring around him as he strove to see all the murres. In the days that followed, through the Norse high summer, Arjun became accustomed to living at the island. The voices of the murres never stopped, and when he dozed fitfully at night, he heard their voices swelling and dying, hissing to sudden peaks of sound and sweeping all around the tiny gullery buried in the midst of the multitude. He wakened fully and saw birds flying against the moon's track and heard the spirited cries of petrels swooping overhead as the night-arriving birds let themselves down to burrows scattered among the murre masses. On some nights, Arjun took to the air and heard the clash of wings in the air around him. The herring gulls were so dominated by the murres that they were forced to fly cautiously to and from their colony. Several juvenile gulls were cut down in aerial collisions with the heavier, faster murres and flopped round the island for days before disappearing. Arjun learned that a safe way of reaching the gullery was up a long, narrow gully, the walls of which were too steep to harbor nesting murres. The other book is called The Gull's Way. It's by Lewis Darling, and it is a library edition, really bound beautifully, a library discard as well. And it's got lots of photographs. This is a chapter on courtship. It's a herring gull island. And in this one, the herring gulls are the main colonizers. And this is off the coast of New England, somewhere in Maine, that he has gone to. And in his foreword, he has some good words to say about Dr. Nico Tinberger's classic The Herring Gulls World. So that could be another place to follow up. So I am going to just share a little bit here from, there's maps in here to show where that map of the North Gullery was, that where he was staying. Opportunists. The early days of any wild thing are the most dangerous. Those of the herring gulls in this rough place were certainly so. The elements were an eternal danger, and undoubtedly the greatest one. A gale at the wrong time could wipe out a large part of an entire season's young. A long spell of cold, wet weather could do the same. A shift in the movements of migratory fish, or the failure of shrimp or other small sea life to appear in season, could make it hard for the parent gulls to raise their usual number of chicks. And I think of the puffin with its only one chick, and the drop in the sea eels, the Atlantic sea eels, making life harder for it. The ever-present black-backed gulls, as well as strange herring gulls, were always ready to make a meal of a wandering or unguarded chick. There was danger, too. The 3-year-old non-breeding gulls began to appear and filter through the colonies. These birds looked like fully adult gulls, and yet they were not quite adult. Their plumage was not all white. There was a smudginess about the belly feathers, and the coverts of their wings, instead of being the smooth gray of adult gulls, were brownish and mottled. Their beaks were only dully yellow and still dark around the tip. The reddish-orange spot scarcely showed. These 3-year-olds began to appear more and more frequently in the area the watcher could see from the blind. They hung around, the breeding birds like tufts on street corners, and they were not adverse to a meal of a gull chick or a late laid eggs. And then he's got a nice drawing to show the juvenile, first winter, second winter, the changes, the third winter. And he did all the drawings. The breeding birds knew very well that the younger birds were dangerous. A pair would not tolerate any strange gull in their territory, but their antagonism toward the 3-year-olds was of a different sort. They were actively hostile toward them. Perhaps this was because the young birds were not old enough to have commenced observing the rituals of gull law, as most of the mature birds did. That being that you didn't enter somebody else's territory. Often a 3-year-old landed on a loafing log behind a territory that's referring to one of the maps. Instantly all the birds in the adjoining territories would straighten in that stiff-necked threat position of the defending herring gull. The younger birds knew that they were on forbidden ground and were always uneasy and alert. Sometimes they obeyed the rules and left immediately, but often they were bold and lingered, hoping for a chance at eggs or a chick. Then the old birds no longer depended on gull formalities, but flew at the trespassers with open beak and violently flailing wings. The defense against the raiding 3-year-olds was a community enterprise. Often, as a breeder drove one out of his territory, the next territory owner took up the chase, and other birds continued it down the shore as far as the watcher could see. The invasion of the 3-year-olds made the man in the blind think about gull predation. Through the years, gulls had acquired a reputation of being vicious predators. Stories about their behavior cite their traits as evil and disgusting, or more commonly, dangerous for the nearby bird life. But the longer the watcher lived with the gulls, the more he learned that these ideas were not entirely true. Not only had some observers judged the wild gulls by human standards, they had also ignored an important part of the reason why these things had happened. He's going to tell. Gulls are opportunists, to be sure, and will pick up a meal where they can find it. They are also among the most adaptable of birds, quick to recognize anything edible and to take advantage of it. Man's unsanitary habits of waste disposal also provide gulls in some areas with large supplies of extra food. This has made possible an almost explosive expansion in both the range and numbers of herring gulls and great black-backed gulls. Where there is gull overpopulation, the gulleries are crowded and predation is doubtless more common. However, our littered beaches and polluted waters would be much worse if it were not for these adaptable birds, which find rich food among our wastes. But in the normal course of events, the food of these uncrowded island gulls seldom consists of the living young of their own species, or even those of other bird species. For example, island eider ducks laid their eggs and hatched their youngs almost side by side with the gulls. When they had rested for a few hours after hatching, the young eiders were escorted by their mothers down into the sea, where several ducks pooled their young in nursery school groups and guarded them cooperatively. These pods of ducks moved almost among the feeding gulls, and the warning grrr growl of the female eider was almost constant. And the gulls respected the eiders. Occasionally, when one of them got too close to a school of ducklings, the nearest duck instantly attacked and surged up over it, onto its back, pecking at its head feathers, treading with its strong webbed feet, and flaying the water into foam with buffeting wings. The gull, squawking and half drowned, escaped as quickly as it could, and others nearby took the warning and moved cautiously a little further from the eider flotilla. Only once did the watcher see a gull with an eider duckling. One evening, a lone herring gull flew high over the tent with an unmistakable silhouette of a limp duckling in its beak. Of course, it might well have been a duckling the bird had found dead from some other cause. Another incident occurred when the man surprised a brood of eiders making their way from nest to sea and frightened the mother away. The duck flew off and landed outside the line of surf, and the terrified young ones scurried into a nearby tide pool. As long as the man stayed close to them, they were safe. But when he moved away a little, the gulls flew in before the shy mother eider dared to return. The ducklings dived when the gulls swooped at them, but invariably they would tire, one by one, and be scooped up and carried away. The watcher knew that all he could do was frighten the gulls as thoroughly as possible and leave at once, hoping the duck would come back before the gulls could take her brood. So he rushed at the white birds, shouting and roaring and flapping his arms and leaping over the ledges like a wild man. Then he hurried away to watch events through his binoculars from a distant hummock. The gulls returned, of course, but now that he was gone, so did the mother duck. She dove through the surf and streaked up over the slippery stones of whack to take charge of her ducklings again. The incident gave him a clue to part of the reason for the black reputation given to gulls. Almost without exception, the deliberate gull predation he had seen in several seasons among the birds was caused by his own or by some other human being's presence in the gulleries. He came to realize that many of the gull villainies reported had happened only because the reporters themselves had been present. They had disturbed the normal course of events. They had upset the protective systems or caused chicks or hidden nests to be revealed and left unguarded when the frightened parents left them. The gulls had been quick to take advantage of these opportunities. This thought made the watcher realize that much other behavior of wild things also was modified by the very act of being watched. He realized that many of the activities he and others had seen did not represent the normal, everyday behavior of these creatures, but was their behavior when being watched by a human. So he became more careful not to disturb the birds, to efface himself as much as possible, and always to move quickly away from the disturbed area. His clothes blended in with the driftwood and the rocks of the island, and he learned to make his movements blend into the background too. Well, now that gives an interesting twist to things. Makes me think about Tenbergen and all the human interactions and temperings and testings and working arounds. I don't know. It's something to think about now. Well, until next time, thanks for joining me, and bye for now.